you may have wondered why I haven't mentioned Solomon yet. I mean, he's clearly the author, right? The book begins, the words of Eccl, son of David, king in Jerusalem. And who else could have performed the experiments of chapters 1 and 2? I mean, it says here that he acquired great wisdom, that he built a huge kingdom, and that he had many concubines. I mean, that sounds like Solomon to me. But the thing is, it's not quite so simple. You see, the book of Proverbs opens Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king in Jerusalem. And the book Song of Songs, it says, the opening word is Song of Songs, which is Solomon, which is Solomon's. So why then would Ecclesiastes apparently avoid this explicit designation? And then there's those strange lines in chapters 1 and 2. Let me show you which lines I'm talking about. So this book, opens in the autobiographical section. I, the preacher, Kohelet, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. This could be Solomon, right? I mean, king in Jerusalem, that makes sense for Solomon. But look at verse 16. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were in Jerusalem before me. Who was in Jerusalem before Solomon? And then look, he does it again in chapter 2. I got all these slaves. I had great possessions, more than any who had been in Jerusalem before me. It's kind of a dig at his dad, isn't it? Look at verse 9. So I became great and surpassed all who were in Jerusalem before me. Who's he talking about? I mean, the only person who was in Jerusalem before Solomon was David. His dad. Is he basically saying, I'm better than my dad? So there. It kind of seems to me that this line teaches us that we're hearing from a voice much later in Israel's history. Now, remember that the voice that we're hearing from here in Ecclesiastes is Kohelet. And who or what is a Kohelet? Well, Kohelet is the noun form of the verb kahal, Kohelet. And kahal simply means to assemble or to gather. And specifically, it's talking about gathering people together. We're gathering people together, and usually what happens when you assemble this group of people is you talk to them, you speak to them. And that's why it's often translated as preacher. Well, you see, there's not very many Kohelets in the Bible. After Moses, he's the first Kohelet. All the rest of them are either David or sons of David. Let me show you this chart. Let's look at a whole bunch of other Kohelets. So here's Moses. He kahaled, he assembled the congregation of the people of Israel. And he did it again in Leviticus chapter 8. And then David, he kahaled all Israel to bring the ark of God. And then he's going to do it again in chapter 15. And Solomon, of course, Solomon kahaled all the elders of Israel and all the heads of all the tribes to bring the ark of the covenant into Zion. And then we have a son of David kahaling, and then we have a son of Solomon kahaling as well, Rehoboam. Now Asa, he didn't kahal, but he did kavatz, and kavatz is a synonym of kahal, and Jehoshaphat is going to kavatz as well. And when he kavatz everyone together, it's called a kahal. It's called an assembly. Hezekiah also, very importantly, kahaled all Israel together for the feast of unleavened bread. Now, what do we learn from this? Well, to kahal, to gather all Israel together, is a royal task. It's something that kings do. And combine this fact with the other fact that all throughout Ecclesiastes are many different hyperlinks and allusions to several different kings from the line of David. If we take those two ideas together, that leads me to believe that Kohelet is not Solomon, but rather a collective persona. It's all of the kings of David, all of the line of David together as one voice, speaking from exile and reflecting on the failure of their kingdom. That's the voice that we're hearing from in Ecclesiastes. It's the whole Davidic line. All of them are mourning the destruction of their kingdom. However, I mean, we have to admit that Solomon's is certainly the most prominent voice that we hear in Ecclesiastes. No one's going to doubt that. And it seems like then it is appropriate for us to say that Kohelet is picturing a sad Solomon at the end of his life. And he's looking back at his many failed attempts to find meaning and purpose apart from God. All of the idols that he chased from his many wives, which just turned out to be Hevel. Well, every king which followed after Solomon in the line of David, they were just kind of like a repetition of Solomon. They were a mini Solomon, sharing some of his successes, but more of his failures. Kind of like a photo mosaic. Do you know what a photo mosaic is? It has this big picture, right? And the big picture is composed of all of these tiny little pictures together. So Kohelet in the book of Ecclesiastes is a big picture of Solomon composed of a whole bunch of little pictures of all of the kings from the line of David. Take a look at this photo mosaic to kind of see what I mean. So in this case, this is a photo mosaic of Jesus. When you zoom in and we see all these little pictures are also of Jesus. But imagine here in this book, what we have, a description of Kohelet is Solomon. The big picture is Solomon. And all these little pictures are all the individual kings from the line of David. Asa, Jehoshaphat, Rehoboam, all of these different kings. And all of them, every one of them is depressed and sad because the kingdom of David, their kingdom, has collapsed. And you know what? This is the exact interpretation that the translators of the Aramaic Targum have of this book. Now, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, but around the time of Jesus, they began to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Aramaic. And they called that translation, when it was completed, they called it the Targum. And honestly, the Targum is definitely not a word-for-word translation from the Hebrew. Well, it's kind of more like a paraphrase that they add a whole bunch of their own interpretation into. Now, I want you to look at some of what the translators added to verse 2 of the first chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes. Look at this. All right, so let's get out of this. I want to look at a different picture. This is what I want to look at. So this is the Aramaic Targum of Ecclesiastes. The first verse is, there's a slight change, which is important. Look at this. It says the words of prophecy, which Kohelet, they spell with a C here, that is the son of David, who was in Jerusalem, prophesied. So the translators of the Targum say that the book of Ecclesiastes is prophecy. That's curious. And then look how much they added to verse 2. This is fascinating. When Solomon, king of Israel, foresaw by the spirit of prophecy that the kingdom under his son Rehoboam would be divided, that Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed, that the people would be led off into captivity. So what they're doing is they're imagining Solomon having a vision of the destruction of his kingdom. And then right after he has that vision, look what he says. Then he said, vanity of vanities, Hevel of Hevels is this world. Hevel, all that I and my father David have labored for, all of that is Hevel. Man, isn't that fascinating? Now, of course, that never happened. Solomon never had this vision, but doesn't it help us to see how from that perspective, the book of Ecclesiastes fits within the Tanakh, and specifically in the Ketuvim. Remember, the Ketuvim, all of it addresses questions that were raised by the exile. And you see how Ecclesiastes can contribute to that conversation from that perspective. You see, life in Babylon is dark. It is confusing. It is short. It's full of contradictions. It doesn't make any sense why the Babylonians would prosper and faithful Israelites like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are slaves in Babylon. That doesn't make any sense. And then, you know what? We're just going to die in Babylon anyways, and no one's going to remember us. We're not going to get carried back to the promised land. It doesn't make any sense. And somehow this message made it into the Bible. This was a divine and a human word which we needed to hear. Or at least that's what Kohelet's chaperone thought we needed to hear. Now, you know what a chaperone is, right? A chaperone is an adult that makes sure that a kid doesn't get into too much trouble. Well, if there was anyone who needed restraint, it would be this dark, morose, melancholy photomosaic of Solomon, right? I mean, this guy needs a chaperone, and the chaperone is the author. You see, there are two voices that are speaking to us in the book of Ecclesiastes. We have the voice of Kohelet, that's the vast majority of the book, but then we also have the voice of the author who introduces the words of Kohelet for our consideration. He presents Kohelet's message to us for our consideration. Let's see how he does that in chapter 1. I want you to pay attention to the change in person. So we have initially the preacher, Kohelet, is referred to in third person. These are the words of the preacher. Let me talk about Kohelet. Vanity of Vanities says Kohelet. That's what he says, talking about him in third person. But then down in verse 12, now it's in first person. I, me, my, I, Kohelet, have been king over Jerusalem. And all of this continues then in first person. Kohelet is speaking, and his chaperone, the author, lets Kohelet go on for a long ways until the conclusion in chapter 12, verse 9. And there in the conclusion, our author is going to critique the criticism of Kohelet. That's what these last 6 verses are here for. And initially, the author is going to start out by giving his endorsement of what Kohelet has said. He says, you know what, Kohelet, that guy was wise. I got to admit, he was wise, and he wrote uprightly words of truth. But then look how he describes these words of truth. The metaphor that he uses to say, these are what the words of Kohelet are like. Let's jump to chapter 12. All right, chapter 12. You know what? The preacher, he was a wise guy, and he had great words of delight. But you know what these words are like, these words of truth? These words are like goads. Goads that are given by a shepherd. Now, we all know what a shepherd's staff looks like. It kind of has this funny little curve on the end. Well, sometimes a shepherd would have a sharp point on the end of his staff, and that's called a goad. And he would use it to poke the sheep and make sure that they're going in the right direction, to guide and to direct the sheep. So the words of Kohelet are like goads. They hurt. They're hard to hear, and yet the author thinks that we need to hear them. We need to get poked by that goad. There's a certain value in looking at the dark corners of this life, to stare death in the face and to realize, yeah, I'm a mortal creature who will die one day. And I think that it's necessary for us to do that because it is so hard for us to escape from the idea that we can find meaning and fulfillment and worth and identity in our career, in our relationships, in pleasure. And Ecclesiastes is here to disabuse us of that notion, to tell us, no, you are going to die one day, and you really can't rely on all these things you're placing your hope in. And honestly, life under the sun is broken, it is hollow, and it is empty. And after all of that, the chaperone is going to step in and he's going to give a word of caution, a warning for how we are to reckon with these words of Kohelet. He says that his words are like goads, and then he says, but you know what, my son, beware of anything beyond this. Don't go past what Kohelet has taught you. You know, if you stare into the void, into the darkness for too long, it will destroy you. Beware of that. Don't go too far. And then he says, of the making of many books, there is no end. You can spend the whole rest of your life trying to figure out the existential questions and puzzles in this life. But you know what? You do all of that, and it's just going to be hevel, says the author. And then in the final words, the final section of the book, the author wants to make crystal clear that he's not advocating for lawlessness or hedonism. And therefore, he says, you know what? The end of the matter has been heard. Fear God and keep the Torah. And in so saying, he aligns the book of Ecclesiastes with the whole corpus of the wisdom literature, which says that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of Yahweh. That's Proverbs chapter 1 and chapter 9. That's Job chapter 28. So he locks himself into that tradition. And then in the very final verse of the book, look how he closes. Chapter 12, verse 14. We get more than just a ray of hope here. He says, for God will bring every deed into judgment. Now, this word judgment, it's kind of a scary word for us in English, isn't it? But it really isn't in Hebrew, because the word judgment is the same word. It's the same root as the word justice. You see, judgment is the moment when God will come to bring justice. And you know, right now, life as we experience it, life under the sun and outside of the garden, it is shrouded in hevel right now, but it won't always be, because one day God is going to come and he will clear the hevel. There will be no more hevel. And on that day, the fog which surrounds us now will be